Right. Well, one of my friends said submarines are really just boring black tubes. Admittedly, he was an aviator and surface warrior, so his view might be a little bit biased because he liked to have things above water. But in the next few minutes, I'll try and attempt to instill a degree of interest in submarines as a varied and sometimes challenging modelling subject. So, those who've heard me talk before will know I like to assemble collections of static models in the same scale to compare and contrast design drivers and solutions. And 135th is a good scale for submarines. Submarines in that scale tend to be about 10 to 30 centimetres in length. They're nice and thin, so you can put quite a lot of them on your display shelves if you have a suitable display cabinet. So you can make quite a big collection in a fairly small space. Most of my models represent post-1945 vessels, so I do occasionally do a foray into the earlier era. And probably the slight majority of my models are Russian, or representing Russian submarines anyway, such as this November class submarine we've got in front of us here, which these days November classes are stuck up in, rotting away in the northern reaches of the Barents Sea and looking fairly rusty and fairly uncared for. The reactors are also not in terribly good condition either. So anyway, I will go through the presentation here. At the end of the presentation, I'll show an evolution chart of the Russian designs, a bit like the chart I showed on surface vessels a couple of months ago. But for this presentation, I will cheat a little and use a few other nations' submarines as examples and a few different eras and scales, just to broaden the scope of the talk. Near the beginning, I say near the beginning because World War II submarines were very little changed really from their World War I predecessors. They were sort of knife-shaped, a bit like a surface vessel because they spent most of their time on the surface. They tried to preserve some degree of seakeeping because of that, and they were powered almost universally by diesel engines. They were only submerged for short periods to prosecute an attack or to evade hostile forces, and their batteries, while underwater, because of course they couldn't use the diesel engine underwater. The batteries had limited energy, and that and the limited air within the hull meant that underwater endurance was very, very constrained. And if you've seen movies like Das Boot and so on, then you know the sort of conditions that people worked in when they were under attack and trying to evade underwater. So armament consisted of torpedoes, the classic weapon for the submarine, and a deck gun, perhaps of 75mm caliber or thereabouts. And certainly later in World War II, some machine guns to use on the top deck to try and ward off any aircraft that tried to attack the U-boat. This particular model, and most of the models, I've made a little comment in the corner about what the model is and where it's come from. This is an out-of-the-box Revel kit. It costs about £6 or £7 if you buy it off eBay, and there's plenty of scope for giving it a nice paint job and making it either look pristine straight out of the shipyard or very, very dirty as if it's just come back from a patrol. And I livened the paint finish up with using some salt crystals sort of dried onto the boat and then spraying different colours on top as the salt crystals gradually worked off. This slide shows where we got to by the end of World War II. Up in the top right corner, you get another German U-boat, the Type 9, which was slightly larger than the Type 7 that we saw earlier. But the Japanese decided to build a massive, great aircraft-carrying submarine. They'd experimented with all sorts of aircraft carried on submarines through the war, generally one or two spotter planes to help the submarine find a convoy or a suitable target for attack. But these boats were something different. 3 of these were built. They were the I-400 series, and these 3 were built to carry 3 float planes each in a hangar adjacent to the sail, and you can see the hangar structure there. The concept of operations for these submarines was to travel all the way across the Pacific. This was 1945. It was towards the end of the war. The Japanese could see that the war in Europe was about to end, and they wanted to close down the Panama Canal. So their mission was to go across the Pacific, to approach the Panama Canal and attack it with a total of 3x3, 9 dive bombers. This was very much a suicide mission. The floats were left off the planes for this mission. Normally, the floats were kept in a separate little hangar apart from the main body of the aircraft, because the main body of the aircraft without floats was a bit easier to put into a tube. But the floats were left off these planes. The bombs that were used were actually welded to the bottom of the plane because these were suicide attacks. They were kamikaze effectively to try and dive into the lock gates of the Panama Canal. And the Japanese also painted the aircraft in US colours as a means of deception to try and make sure that their aircraft, at least a few of them, penetrated to the target. Luckily, the war ended, and the surrender of Japanese forces was executed before these had actually reached the Panama Canal. And as the U-boats came back across as the Japanese boats came back across the Pacific, they pushed the aircraft over the side because obviously dressing them up in US colours was against the normal rules of war. Innovations from World War II found their way into submarine design soon after the war. We've just seen that giant submarine, which we'll come back to a little bit later. But the Germans in particular experimented and developed larger batteries with better capacity. They developed the snorkel, which allowed the submarine to come to periscope depth and draw air in to support diesel operations just under the water. And the Germans have started to streamline their boats as well. This was taken further by all the victorious allies after World War II, but particularly the Russians. The Russians enjoyed picking the brains of German technologists and building a large number of submarines that were diesel-powered, streamlined, better suited to operating underwater, using things such as the snorkel to increase some endurance. And the streamlining, of course, reduces hydrodynamic noise, which means you've got a faster boat, but also a quieter boat. So it's harder for the enemy to detect that boat on passive listening sonar, which was coming into the fore in the 1950s. So these were more efficient and effective submarines. And this one's a Romeo-class submarine. It's about the sort of 1.5 generation after World War II. And it gives a good example of the kind of boat that the Russians turned out in their hundreds during this period. The next massive change, at least for some of the navals, was the introduction of nuclear propulsion. Reactors heated water to raise steam, which then drove machinery. And there was plenty of excess power from a nuclear reactor to use for other things, such as pure water distillation. You could take seawater in and convert it into drinkable water for the crew. And you could also split seawater into hydrogen and oxygen and create oxygen for the crew to breathe. So nuclear power gave the navies the opportunity to have submarines that could operate for a long time underwater without having to come up for air for the diesels. And it didn't need to come up for air for the crew either. So you could have long patrols underwater. But the shape of the submarines, certainly the first nuclear one, Nautilus, was still the knife shape that was more suited to surface operations. True submarines, though, with their natural habitat being under the surface, had arrived, and Nautilus was one of the last nuclear submarines, as well as being the first nuclear submarine. It was one of the last submarines that was using the knife shape of a vessel. Once submarines were able to operate underwater for significant lengths of time, a teardrop hull form became the norm. The Russians, as well as the US and to some extent other nations, looked at trying to make extreme teardrop shapes. Obviously, if you have no sail at the top of the boat, you can reduce drag. The sail normally contributes about 25% of the drag of the submarine underwater. But they did experiment going to the full extreme of this sailless concept in the bottom left-hand corner here. Unfortunately, they realised experimentally that having a sail was quite useful in keeping stability when you were manoeuvring a submarine. The sailless concept was not really a practical thing when you were trying to control a submarine with manual controls. So sails remained. We then look at weapons beyond propulsion and hull shape. Cruise missiles were coming to the fore. During World War II, primitive cruise missiles have been developed by most nations that were involved in the war. And certainly the US in the mid-1950s took forward the idea of putting cruise missiles on submarines. Clearly, if you can put a cruise missile on a submarine and the submarine can travel underwater for a reasonably long amount of time, you can penetrate enemy defences quite stealthily, come to the surface, get your cruise missile out of its hangar and launch it against the enemy coastline, some of the cities on the shoreline there. So that was a good operational concept for the Cold War. both the US and the Russians developed these, and this is an American boat. This was, I can't remember which one this was, Greyback or Halibut, one of those. I think it was Halibut. This was a submarine where the front of the submarine had been enlarged to create a hangar to hold this massive great cruise missile. It was basically an aircraft without a pilot in the early days. This was able to carry two of these pilotless aircraft. The only problem with the concept of operations was that the aircraft had to be guided by radar. And the radar horizon of the submarine, when it's right down on the surface of the water, is only a few miles. And yet the missile had a range of maybe 300 or 400 miles. So in order to make this work properly, you had to have a chain of radar relay stations to control the missile as it progressed towards the target. So either meant you needed a launching submarine some way back, maybe a couple of hundred miles away from the coastline, then a chain of submarines towards that coastline, popping up and using their radar, which made them quite vulnerable, or else you need some other kind of control mechanism. And the other mechanism that the Americans picked on was having aircraft flying along within radio reach of the cruise missile, guiding it all the way to the target. And when you think about it, really, it's quite silly to have aircraft following the unguided, the unmanned missile all the way to the target, because you might just as well have aircraft going to the target. So it was a concept which sort of didn't really last for very long, certainly not in that form. Lots of nations followed suit with cruise missiles, and cruise missiles then evolved into the form that didn't require something to go alongside, didn't guide it all the way into the target. But we ended up with things that were effectively fire and forget missiles. You could fire them towards a target location, and they would have some kind of seeker technology in the front of the missile, which allowed them to do terminal guidance towards the target of choice. And so that sort of missile, Exocet is a classic example of that. The Chinese copied Exocet and made similar sorts of missiles, and they put them in submarines, just as the Russians and the Americans did as well. And this submarine, it's a Chinese Romeo. We saw the Romeo earlier, which is a diesel submarine. By 1975, the Chinese had license-built Romeo submarines from the Russians, and they converted a number of these to be able to fire cruise missiles. Once again, these cruise missiles had to be launched from the surface, so the submarine was a bit vulnerable while the operation was in progress. But these missiles were held in their own little launch tubes rather than having to be manually hauled out of a hangar before launch. And so the submarine was exposed for a smaller amount of time. You could carry more missiles, they were smaller, despite having a similar sort of range profile. And you could fairly quickly get your submarine out of the way once you'd fired your salvo missiles and hopefully survive to fight another day. And the ultimate in cruise missile submarines is probably the Russian Oscar-class submarine, famous, of course, because of the Kursk tragedy that occurred in 2000, where one of these submarines had an accident in the Barents Sea and sank with the loss of all lives. The Oscar is an absolutely huge submarine. It's almost as big as the famous Typhoon submarine, which we'll see a bit later. This carried 24 large cruise missiles in silos to each side of the sail, 12 on each side. It was nuclear powered. It was able to cruise around under the ice or down into the Atlantic or out into the Pacific for many, many weeks. And it had enough firepower on board a single submarine to take out an entire carrier group. So these were quite formidable beasts, and they're still in service with the Russian Navy at the moment. So that's the ultimate cruise missile submarine. It could fire from under the water. It didn't need to reveal its presence. The only thing you would see is these missiles emerging from the surface of the water, if you happen to have something close enough to observe that. Very, very competent design there. Very, very large, though, and takes quite a significant crew to man and operate. So that was cruise missiles. The other kind of missile that goes on submarines is a ballistic missile. Ballistic missiles have an advantage in that generally you sort them out to be longer range than cruise missiles. That's a broad statement there, but certainly in the 1960s this was the case. And we have here a wonderful picture of the first box art of a Revell ballistic missile submarine. This was produced at the same time, just about as the Polaris submarines were first going into service with the US Navy, which was sometime before the Royal Navy. So early 60s, this was coming along. The Polaris program was really quite something. The US Navy was touting it as the answer to to everybody's worries when it came to deterrence. They were building something like 41 submarines, the 41 for freedom, each of them filled with ballistic missiles. A reasonable fraction of those could be at sea at any one time, and they could hold targets in the Soviet Union at risk. And they were quite invulnerable. If you've got a ballistic missile submarine that can launch from underwater, then it can patrol the oceans, maybe 2,000 kilometers or more away from the potential targets, and has plenty of space to roam around. It's fairly invulnerable. They're normally fairly quiet. They just poodle along very, very quietly under the water without making much noise, very difficult to detect. The particular Revel kit that's shown on the box here isn't very accurate, or at least it shows 8 missile tubes, 4 on each side of the boat, whereas the real submarine had 8 on each side for 16. However, the portrayal of the reactor of the machinery spaces caused consternation, and the legend goes that the model was rapidly removed from the shelves of Washington toy shops by the FBI because they feared that there'd been a leak in the design of the Polaris boats, and they were somewhat concerned that the Russians would get hold of these wonderfully detailed models. As a result, the US Navy offered to provide more information to Revel when it came to building cutaway submarine models, as long as the reactor compartment was fiddled around with, so it didn't look quite so authentic. And here is one of the Revel cutaway submarines. Revel actually market 2 cutaways at the moment, one that's about 1/250 scale and one at 200th scale. They're both rather nice. The 200th one scale here I particularly like. Most of the core detail that you see there is it gives you a good indication of what the inside of a ballistic missile submarine is like. It has the machinery spaces at the back end with the diesels and generators. It has the reactor compartment. You can see the little boiler there with the heat exchanger. It has the missile compartment in front of it with the right number of missile tubes. It has one missile that you can fire out on a little spring if you really want to. And it has the control room underneath the fin with all the masts and various accommodation spaces. And at the far front, you've got the torpedo room, of course. This one, I've sort of embellished a little bit, putting in some extra details. I made the masts much more realistic with brass tubing. I printed off on small scale some little displays for the consoles, maps on the walls, diagrams in the captain's cabin of his submarine, generally to make it a little bit nicer. Curtains on the bunks as well, because otherwise it was rather Spartan. And you can pick that up for about £25 or so and really go to town on it as a rather nice submarine model. And it even has a rather fetching galley space. We have there in front of us just a few of the details from that submarine. Lovely galley there with pots and pans and a tea urn by the look of it, or a hot water urn, probably for coffee, being an American boat. If we move to Russian submarines now, the Russians also were investigating ballistic missiles and submarines. They had their copies of V2 rockets from World War II, which evolved into the Scud missile of great fame. There was quite a push to move Scud missiles onto sea platforms as well as using them on land. The only problem was it was a bit of a beast. It had all sorts of horrible fuels inside. It was liquid propelled. And the submarine, in order to use it, had to come on the surface, wallow around for about 15 minutes while the missile was raised in a sort of spider's web kind of cradle before it could be finally fueled, lined up, and then fired. And the other problem was that Russian submarines at that time had a smaller diameter pressure hull and outer hull, and they had to build bulges underneath their submarine in order to accommodate the full length of the Scud missile, which was poking up through the sail of the submarine to give it its full height. And you could only fit 2 or 3 into the enlarged sail and the bulge underneath. So it was nowhere near as complex as the American design with the 16 missile tubes. But submarine-launched ballistic missiles evolved just as the submarines evolved, and the Russian assembly there, you can see on the left the Scud equivalent, and they got broadly larger and certainly larger diameter as they evolved through the sort of ensuing 30 or 40 years or so. Similar with USA and France, slightly behind was China. China's only really just becoming a really good user of submarine launched ballistic missiles at the moment. Of course, as you're introducing these new weapons into submarines, you need to test them. There are various test rigs set up in the nether reaches of Russia, sea-based ones as well as land-based ones. And once you've managed to prove reasonably safe launching of your missile from a sea-based rig like the one in the top right-hand corner, you can begin to introduce it into your live submarines with real crews. And it's quite well known that the Russians had all sorts of interesting disasters at different times with some of their submarines adopting that technology. But the Russians, of course, like doing things big, and the biggest beast of all was the Typhoon submarine. This was absolutely enormous. It came on the scene sort of it was being built in the late 70s, came on the scene in the early 80s. This one, as somebody mentioned earlier, a normal submarine, you have an inner pressure hull, which is the thing that protects the crew and the innards of the submarine from the seawater pressure. You tend to have an outer hull, which is more streamlined and which is free flooding and allows you to adapt your buoyancy to a degree. And on the line diagrams you see there, the yellow is the pressure hulls, and the blue is the outline of the outer casing. The Typhoon has numerous pressure hulls. It had two side by side running the length of the submarine. So for stars, it was like two submarines joined at the hip. It had another pressure hull for the command and sail area, and another separate pressure hull for the torpedo room in the front there. And I think another one, but look at the diagram at the back there. So a complex beast. Certainly when it came on the scene, Western nations were quite amazed at how large it was. And it did stimulate lots of interesting things, such as the movie The Hunt for Red October and the book that went with it. Very similar submarine in the movie and the book. 20 launch tubes. By this stage, the Russians were quite competent at adopting the layout similar to American boats, where you've got 2 rows of tubes within the submarine, each carrying a very large ballistic missile. And the Typhoon was designed to operate in bastions up in the Barents Sea. The missiles had very long range. They didn't really need to go more than a few yards from Russian coastline in order to launch against the continental USA. So this was a true sort of intercontinental deterrent. And they could wander out under the ice, poodle around until given the command to actually execute. So it was quite a good deterrent. 6 Typhoon submarines were built, and the last one went out of service just a few months ago. It had been used as a trials vessel for the last couple of years. This is the hobby boss model of the Russian submarine Typhoon that we just saw in the previous slide. This one comes quite interestingly with moulded tile details on the side. You can see all the little acoustic tiles. These are rubber tiles stuck to the more modern submarines to try and absorb sonar energy and not reflect as much back to the prosecuting aircraft submarine or sonar sensor that's trying to find the Typhoon. We have tiles as well, which we'll see in a moment. But this is one of the few submarine models where, rather than just having a very smooth, flat plastic surface, you have the tiles moulded on. The moulding is a little bit crude. It's quite deeply entrenched. It's reminiscent of I don't know if any of you ever bought the old Matchbox aircraft kits back in the 1960s or 70s, but they generally had trenches for all the moulding detail on them, and this is slightly reminiscent of that. Nevertheless, it's quite a good representation of a Typhoon, and it only costs, again, £20 or £30. Now, talking about tiles, here's a UK Vanguard submarine. Vanguard is our 2nd generation ballistic missile launching submarine. It's not much smaller than the Typhoon, actually. Lengthwise, it's very, very similar, similar to the US Ohio class boats as well, which also launched Trident. This is a Vanguard once it has come back from a long patrol, over 6 months at sea. The Vanguard class submarines, we've got 4 of them as part of our nuclear deterrent. The idea being that you have one in refit at any one time, you have one at sea, one preparing to go to sea, and one sort of having minor maintenance. So in a crisis, you could have maybe 2, possibly even 3 boats out at sea. However, these boats were first introduced in 1996. The first one came along to start replacing the Polaris boats. they're getting a bit long in the tooth, and some of them need an awful lot of refitting done to them when they come back, which means that the next boat that goes out has to stay on patrol for longer. And there's this vicious cycle of longer and longer patrols, more and more maintenance being required when they come back, which makes it very difficult to maintain a continuous at-sea deterrent. But the UK is managing it, and it's managing it even though the boats look rather cruddy when they come back in from patrol. I really feel for the crew that have been out for 6 months or so on these vessels, because it's psychologically, it must be really quite awful if you're expecting to go out for 90 days away from your family and you are actually out for 180 or longer. But here we are. We have a wonderful Vanguard submarine with all sorts of algae and biofouling on the surface there. But you can see the acoustic tiles. When the UK started using acoustic tiles, we tended to lose most of them on patrol because the glues weren't terribly good. They're somewhat better now, and so when a boat comes back from patrol, most of the tiles tend to be still on the boat. You can see one or two patches there in the picture in the top right where tiles have fallen away, and you can see slightly rusty patches of outer hull underneath those. So here's a couple of models of Vanguard. Bronco is a Chinese company. It makes a 350th scale Vanguard. Again, it's quite a nice model. The top one I made about 10 years ago, just straight out of the box. So you can see the Trident missile popping up out of the one of the tubes there. It's a fairly straightforward model, and as you can see, it's very flat plastic. It doesn't have the moulded detail of the Typhoon that we saw earlier. And down below is one that I made a couple of months ago, really in a tribute to the submariners who came back in that horribly encrusted boat that we saw on the previous slide. That was about 9 months ago. They came back from patrol. So I thought I'd make a Bronco submarine, slightly adapted to add tiles in and really messed up as if it was just back from patrol. First of all, we have to make the tiles. What I did in the end was use 1mm width masking tape and just wound a massive great spiral all the way along the submarine and painted over it, took that off, made longitudinal strips of the same thing, painted over it, and you ended up with a tile pattern that you can see in the top left there. That took some time. I don't think I'll do that again. I tried various other means of getting tile patterns on submarines, and none have really worked very well before. But I've written a little dit in there, which can go in the log in a few months' time, about some of these techniques here in a bit more detail. And then the really sort of sticky, gooey, greeny, gungy stuff on top. I experimented using acrylic paints, but mixing various salts and other solutions into other crystals into the solution, and then letting it dry and encrust, and then wiping it off and putting another layer on and putting another layer on and wiping it off, slightly different shades each time, and building up a rather nasty sort of algae-like finish. I was quite happy with that, but in the end, I don't think I put enough greenery on it compared to the real thing. When things come back from patrol, there's an awful lot of interesting features sometimes on the submarines, and that gives a lot of scope for modelling. Top left, you've got a boat that was obviously used for torpedo trials or practice, which got hit and impaled rather than the practice torpedo bouncing harmlessly off. You've got some other submarines that have had collisions. I'm sure none of them were with Western submarines whatsoever. And there's a very famous collision that occurred in 1997 where the French Triomphant submarine happened to find the same bit of Atlantic Ocean as one of our Vanguard class submarines, and there was a bit of a bump. I think in practice it was the French driving on the wrong side of the road, though they might argue that it was us driving on the wrong side of the road. But in any case, I built a French Triomphant submarine, which is their equivalent of our Vanguard, and I messed up the front nose there and showed a little bit of interior sonar dome. That one raises a few laughs, apart from French visitors who are rather cross sometimes. But anyway, it was probably a 50-50 no-fault collision, I would think. But what it does actually show is that even though there aren't that many submarines floating around the Atlantic Ocean at any one time, maybe 10 if you're lucky, there are some sweet spots in the ocean that submariners like to go to, and sometimes a cunning submarine captain will be just as cunning as his opposite number, and they will end up choosing the same spot to hide in. Let's move on to sensors. Everybody knows submarines have periscopes, and through the periscope you can see things. But there are other sensors that submarines use as well. On the left there, we have a radar dish, which is cunningly hidden in the front of the sail of a Russian submarine, and it rotates out when it needs to guide a cruise missile towards its target. Very cunning, not very hydrodynamic, certainly not very helpful to have to surface and keep that radar going while the missile's in flight. You really want to be closing down and scooting away from the datum point where you launch from. In the middle there, we have a thing that looks a bit like a Doctor Who Dalek. That's an electronic support measures mast that senses electronic emissions from radars and communication systems and direction finds them. So a submarine can determine whether perhaps a little bit over the horizon there might be a carrier battle group or something that needs to be prosecuted. On the right there, we've got various masts from a Russian submarine, again, direction finding, radar, maybe a couple of satellite communication terminals, maybe a couple of low frequency communication terminals. The bottom center, you've got a pod, which is on the back of a Russian submarine, laying out a little thing that looks a bit like a sea snake, actually, but it's reeling out a very long towed array cable, a sonar cable that goes behind the submarine and creates a very, very long baseline, which allows it to get accurate sonar bearing information from targets. And on the right there, we have an interesting picture of a Soviet submariner not looking very happy that he's being photographed, and the thing in front of him, that sort of fin with some stuff sprouting off the front of it, that's a non-acoustic sensor pod, which is looking at things that aren't normally detectable under the water. To take an example, I mentioned earlier that nuclear submarines in the 60s and 70s would hydrolyze water to create oxygen for the crew. That also created hydrogen. The hydrogen was dumped overboard as the submarine went along. Certainly one of the Russian sensors there was a hydrogen sensor, which allowed the submarine to pick up this hydrogen trail and follow the submarine that was producing it. These sorts of sensors have been played around with for a number of years on the Russian side, certainly. And they're of limited use, but every little helps, as Tesco would say, when you're trying to find an enemy submarine in a large ocean. And the Russian system for non-acoustic detection of submarines using things like hydrogen sensing or weight detecting is their SOX system. It's the Russian acronym. And they took one of their ballistic missile submarines in the late 60s. This was during the time when arms control negotiations were making some headway, and the Russians took some of their oldest ballistic missile submarines out of service as far as ballistic missile use was concerned, and they converted them to trials platforms. So there's some interesting diagrams you can pick up in the technical literature showing the array of sensors on these submarines. And I took a standard Zvezda hotel SSBN kit and converted it into this trials boat that the Russians used. And you can see on the right there the tiny little sensors that were deployed on the front there to try and detect these minute changes in the sea around them. It took a little bit of work to get those built, and I was generally using 100 micron wire with 0.2 millimeter wide plastic to try and build these sensors up at the right sort of scale. I wouldn't recommend doing this in 700 scale rather than 300 scale, because that would be rather nasty. I think I might need some more glasses soon. And here we have one of the more modern boats. It's an Akula submarine, and this was brought into service after those trials had proved successful. And photos of the submarine show you the kind of sensors that have been developed and put on board, and are still put on board Russian submarines these days, besides all the normal sonar and periscope and radar sensors that go on the boats. And the UK got in on the act as well, and there were some photos of one of our Trafalgar-class submarines off Gibraltar about 3 years ago, sporting a rather nice set of experimental weight detection sensors that were mimicking the kind of things that the Russians have been up to. And again, I took an Airfix Trafalgar-class submarine and modified that to add the appropriate sensors on board. besides all these big submarines, we've seen some really, really quite big ones earlier. There's some tiddly ones as well, some sort of 3 to 20 man submarines. They do all sorts of things. They can be used for inserting special forces to quiet locations along coastlines. They can also be used for ocean survey. And I've got a Russian X-ray submarine here. The model is some 350 scale, but it's about 8 centimeters long. And X-ray was a quote ocean survey submarine with little manipulator arms under the front of the boat there. This one is depicted in a little diorama, clearly mending an undersea cable and perhaps helpfully recovering some salvage from the seabed. Very handy to have that sort of submarine if you want to do that sort of thing. You can get model submarines that are based in fiction, and if those of you who might have long memories might have seen the Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea series back in the 60s and the films that went with it. That's the Sea View submarine in 350 scale that was the heart of that programme. What really never gelled with me was the fact that this was supposed to be a private research submarine, but it's got 20 Polaris nuclear missile tubes on the back end. And the two things don't really gel with me. But anyway, that was fiction. And there are various other fictional submarines, like Jules Verne Nautilus is a popular model that can be obtained in various forms. Because obviously he described his Nautilus in prose, and various model manufacturers have interpreted that in different ways. And if we move from fiction to future fact, there's some pictures here on the left there. We've got the British Aerospace Systems concept art for the UK Dreadnought submarine. This will replace our Vanguard submarines in the early 2030s. Again, it will still carry Trident as a ballistic missile weapon to maintain our continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent. It looks very sleek there. I'm sure the real thing will have a few sort of bells and whistles on it that make it not quite so sleek as that image. And there's a very comparable Russian image here from the Malachite Ship Bureau, sort of touting their 2030s Russian future sub-concept. Again, you can see the evolution of design where they've tried to reduce the sail a bit more. They've got some missile tubes behind the sail, presumably for ballistic missiles. And it looks as if there's a vertical launch pack at the front there for some cruise missiles. Designs are generally converging. I'm sure the reality of the Malachite design and Dreadnought won't be an awful lot far apart from each other, but those will be fact fairly shortly. I mentioned charting Russian evolution. So this is the same sort of format as the surface vessel chart I did a couple of months ago, showing how the various attack submarines, cruise missile submarines, ballistic missile submarines, and diesels at the bottom evolved. I've tried to indicate that broadly the drivers that have made those evolutionary moves necessary or possible. So things such as applying German rocketry to deterrence meant you put ballistic missiles in submarines so you could hide them at sea and keep a reasonable deterrent even if your homeland was being attacked. And on the far right here, future 2025, 2050, who knows what's going on, but I suspect that designs will converge to a few classes. It was very expensive for the Russians in the 1980s to maintain multiple different designs of submarine and keep them all at sea. And that brings me to the end of my talk. Submarines might evolve onto land ships eventually, possibly, who knows, just like this Russian Tango here. And if we go to the next slide, there's some references there. There's the usual sorts of books from people like Norman Polmar, this guide to Soviet Navy. He's got a very good book on Cold War submarines, which has all sorts of cutaway diagrams to look at. There's a lovely book as well that was published only about 2 years ago from a Dutchman, Jamie Carriman, in Deepest Secrecy, and that goes all the way through the exploits of Dutch submarines from the mid-60s through to the early 90s, through the major parts of the Cold War and some of the espionage activities they undertook. Fascinating reading. And if you're really into these things, you can pick up some Russian literature as well, which goes into inordinate detail about some of their submarine designs. They were published in the early 90s when the Russian design bureaus were opening up and wanting to show how good they were to the world. And that was a little bit before Putin came to power and closed everything down, and now it's almost impossible to get detailed design information out of the Russians. But those books were lovely. Anyway, I shall stop there